Welcome to another exciting video, or willkommen in einem Video. This is part 5 of my organisational series of videos. In this case I've moved over to the Napoleonic Wars and will be covering the French army between 1804 and 1807. Unlike my other videos, there was no way I could create a single video covering the entire French army, and even these slices are a major undertaking. I create these in order to assist in my efforts to create army lists, but the bulk of the video is a historical analysis of the TIEL, or GLIEDERUNGEN, of the French army between the years of 1804 and 1807. Creating army lists for generic games is a constant issue. Using historical force mixes from specific battles works well, but this video is an attempt to understand the basic organisational structure of a nation's army, looking for ways we could use that data to create army lists, as well as help us understand how a nation's military evolved during the Napoleonic War. Talking specifically about army lists, one method is you could try and understand the entire army of a nation in a particular period and try and create an army list from this basic data set. There are many issues with this, and it's something I generally avoided in the past, but I've noticed that Garde du Corps rules makes an attempt in this direction. This shows the Garde du Corps data for the French army. The key values to consider here is the first number, which represents the number of units, and the last number, which represents the number of figures, each representing 60 men in that units. Units can either be battalions or regiments. This got me rather excited until I realised it was filled with errors, or at least the data was twisted to fit in with the rules. I'll not cover the details of the errors, and if you're interested, these are listed in more detail in my Prussian and Austrian videos. But it made me realise that in order to do the job properly, the amount of work is astronomical. While I feel Garde du Corps does a magnificent job, it is not 100% correct. I've made a number of corrections, and this shows the current state of my corrected data, but my research is not completed, and as a result this is not completed. For example, there are 89 line regiments in 1805, which is not shown here. The other issue is this data is designed to support a set of rules at a specific scale for that set of rules, and it is trying to create a fun game as a result. A lot of fudging is required in order to allow players to field the range of figures that they would prefer. The main error was the depicting of the number of regiments correctly, but giving it the strength of battalion. As an example, we see the French have 50 line regiments. This is not correct, and the number should be actually closer to 89, but I've not fully corrected this, as I've indicated earlier. But let's for the moment assume it's 50. Each regiment contains 24 figures, or 6 elements, at a scale of 61. So you quickly discover that in terms of elements, the overwhelming bulk of elements should be line infantry elements, with only a token number of other infantry or even cavalry. Players would be not pleased discovering most of their nice cavalry cannot be deployed, and instead they need to deploy lots and lots and lots of line infantry. Even the guard becomes a token force. By decreasing the number of line infantry elements, each player can start fielding other troop types in greater numbers. Good for the rules and for the game, but not good for historical accuracy. And it's basically one of the issues with trying to derive historical facts from rules, because rules have a slightly different objective to a completely objective view of historical data or information. A lot of the source material I'm using in this video comes from the excellent Napoleonic Armies by Ray Johnson. Another source I use is the excellent Armies of the Napoleonic Era by Otto von Pifka. This shows the English translated front cover. In my attempts to discover good source material to use for this video, I did find this. I do not possess this book, but I must admit this looks like a very interesting reference document which I will consider purchasing. I found this on Scribd, or Scribd, which is a site I have no experience with. I have to assume it's probably safe, but anyone who wishes to access this may wish to be cautious, at least initially. Quick caveat: this video is an overview of this topic and not an in-depth, historically enlightening analysis. I'm sure others possess superior knowledge and experience in this topic, but for those who wish a layman's analysis, this video is for you. As is my normal process, before we actually drill down into the TIEL of the French army, let's provide you with an overview of the different troop types the French employed. As I'll be describing, units are based on these troop types, and it's very easy to get confused when you look at different troop types in the Napoleonic era, because it's steeped in tradition and history which is lost in the mist of time, and quite frankly sometimes it's contradictory. The Old Guards were the elite troops of the French army. The main focus seems to be experience rather than size of the man, as would be the case for, for example, grenadiers, but I assume some companies would consist of large guys. In many ways, the Old Guard was unique as they represented both elite and veteran qualities. While you could argue elements of the Russian Guard in 1813-14 could also be veteran and also elite, most guards in most armies would not be classed in this manner. Incidentally, during this period, it was not referred to as Old Guard. Guards were simply guards. The Guard Velites, which later became the Middle Guard, were guard quality troops, but which lacked the experience of the Old Guard. The Old Guard were elite veterans. The Guard Velites were just elite. Being a veteran means you've seen it all and are more experienced in the practical aspects of warfare. Being guard means you have high morale and willingness to do things other formations would be unwilling to do. Both aspects have their pluses and negatives. In 1806, they were dramatically expanded. The Guard Velites were initially called New Guard because they were the New Guard, but this was only a nickname. They finally were formally called Middle Guard. I'm not quite sure if that occurred in 1806, but it certainly occurred at some point after that if it didn't occur in 1806. The Guard Marines were a bit of a surprise when I did my research. What were Marines doing in the Guard? These were Marines which are classed as guards. Some rules give these troops excellent combat abilities but with poor skirmishing capabilities. I'm uncertain if this is accurate, but this is yet another type of guard, and yes, I did find them in the orders of battles of at least one major battle, very far away from the ocean. The converged elites of depot battalions were extracted, or were the best troops extracted from regiments involved in garrison activities and placed into a single formation, specifically in Austerlitz. The order of battle calls them grenadiers, which cannot be correct as the number of grenadiers would have been far too small for them all to be grenadiers, so I expect all the elite or best troops from the 9 to 10 regiments performing garrison duties were combined in this formation. I would expect these troops would be better than the average line infantry and were used in the same manner as grenadiers would have been used in, let's say, the Austrian army. The French traditionally paid for a number of Swiss regiments, which served in the French army between 1805 and 1807. Many rules classed them as a veteran, and they were organised and structured in the same way as French regiments. The backbone of the French army were its line infantry. Part of each battalion consisted of grenadiers, skirmishers, and the bulk fusiliers. The French battalion adopted the combined arms approach, so rather than extracting grenadier companies to form converged grenadier battalions, they left them in the standard or their home battalion, and they normally led the charge if they were attacking in a melee situation. This gave the French line infantry an attacking capability that, let's say, the Austrians and in some cases the Prussians lacked. Could also explain why the French had such a focus on guards. Sometimes you do need a full battalion of big elite guys, and the guards would have satisfied that requirement in the French army. The French light infantry were made up of smaller men and trained as light infantry as well as line infantry. Later in the war, this distinction disappeared, but in 1805-07, these were the equivalent of Grens or Prussian fusiliers. While they lacked grenadiers in each battalion, they did have an equivalent. I'm uncertain if this company in each battalion was mainly focused on melee or simply a very good fire combat, but nonetheless it was an elite company within the light infantry battalion. The French Navy was not going anywhere after Trafalgar, so the French formed a number of marine battalions from their otherwise idle marines. The Reserve and National Guards are not really covered in any of the TONEs in this period, as they generally didn't take to the field, but the French did have a large number of National Guards used to garrison the mother country. The carabiners were heavy cavalry which lacked a cuirass or armour. However, after 1809 they began to wear a cuirass and were effectively the same as cuirassiers. They are heavy cavalry. The cuirassiers were the other type of French cavalry, heavy cavalry, and they were made up of large men on large horses. They wore a cuirasse, which was effectively armour. The dragoons were classed as medium cavalry by some and heavy by others. The horses were still larger, and the men used a straight sword designed to thrust forward, so they were used in the same way as heavy cavalry. They were also equipped with a carbine, which could, in theory, allow them to fire from their saddle, but for the most part they were used in the same manner as other heavy cavalry. The French dragoons did occasionally fight on foot in 1813. There was at least one dismounted French dragoon formation, but in this case due to a lack of horses. The chasseurs à cheval were the standard French light cavalry. They had small but fast and mobile horses, were armed with a sabre, and were designed to fight other cavalry from the side rather than forward. They were excellent scouting and reconnaissance cavalry. The hussars were also light cavalry, and of all the light cavalry had the reputation of being party animals. They had small but fast and mobile horses, were armed with a sabre, and were designed to fight other cavalry from the side rather than forward. They were very effective in exploiting any breakthroughs and riding down fleeing enemy infantry, which is why they were often at the rear of a brigade, ready to exploit such an occurrence. The lancers were lance-armed cavalry, or light cavalry, which could fulfil the same functions as hussars, but also had a very good anti-cavalry capacity in the form of their lance. The poor man's shock cavalry in many ways. Using a lance was not easy to do effectively, so they were rarely inexperienced soldiers. I've broken this up into three main periods. The period of 1803 to 04 was really a period of reorganisation. The main periods are the period between 1805 and also 1806-07, and the French engaged in a major campaign during each of these periods. There were some changes between these two periods, and these will be raised, but the 1805 structure could apply to the French army prior to 1805 as well, and the changes were not really major or that major. When Britain declared war on France in 1803, Napoleon assembled an army close to the English Channel, hoping to invade England. This never occurred, but while he was there he instigated a number of reforms and reorganisations. The result was the army which won most of Napoleon's greatest victories up to 1812. This shows the French regular army in 1805, excluding the Guards. In 1803, the French had 89 regiments of line infantry, numbered 1 to 112. 23 numbers were vacant. The French were supposed to have 156 line infantry regiments in 1805. I'm also uncertain if the number of 156 includes the light infantry regiments or not. In 1803, the French had 26 regiments of light infantry, numbered 1 to 30. 4 numbers were vacant. Light infantry regiments were raised in departments which were mountainous. I suspect the number of 156, which was roughly the number of departments in France, included a line, light and other regiment types I'm unaware of, some of which may not have been taken into the field and thus not counted as part of the field army. That's why I get the number of 156. Basically, in 1805, the French did only have 89 line infantry regiments, to the best of my knowledge. There were two main types of infantry regiments. These were line and light. Both consisted of 2 battalions, which were normally taken into the field, and a depot battalion. The French mixed troop types in their line infantry battalion, as did the British, with one company being grenadier, one being a voltigeur, and the remaining 7 being fusiliers. The grenadiers were large men which led any attack. The voltigeurs were the skirmishers, and the fusiliers were the bulk of the line infantry. The light infantry regiment was organised in a similar manner, except the grenadiers were replaced with carbineers. I'm uncertain if the carbineers were large men or not, but at least they would have been considered as elite troops. Company size was supposed to be 123 men, however on average this rarely rose above 80 men per company. In addition to the French line infantry, the Swiss provided 4 regiments until 1811, organised basically in the same manner as French line infantry, at least in the battalion level. However, each regiment consisted of 4 battalions instead of 2 battalions, so they were quite large, and they apparently had attached or permanently attached artillery. The French heavy and medium cavalry regiments consisted of 4 squadrons each of 160 men each, in theory. As with the infantry, this value was not common, and squadrons were or most often about 120 men in size each. The light cavalry was also organised into 4 squadron regiments, with the average strength of the regiment being about 120 men. The artillery was, in theory, organised into 8-gun foot batteries, of which 2 were howitzers, and 6-gun horse artillery batteries, again 2 being howitzers. When you look at the actual order of battles, this did vary a great deal, especially in terms of gun type. The Guards experienced the greatest change between 1805 and 1806. In 1805, the French possessed 3 Guard regiments, 1 Grenadier, 1 Chasseur and 1 Light, and also a Marine regiment in their Guard division or corps. These 3 regiments were eventually called Old Guard, although in 1805 each possessed a battalion of velites, which were elite troops which were not veterans and later became the Middle Guard. In 1806, 2 more Guard regiments were raised, 1 Grenadier and 1 Chasseur, and the velites were removed to form what was to eventually be called the Middle Guard. The velite battalions, which were removed from the original Guard regiments, were increased in size to form 2 new Guard regiments, 1 Grenadier and 1 Chasseur. They were initially called New Guard because they were new, but became known as the Middle Guard in 1810. Until then, both these regiments were still considered as full Guard regiments in the Guard, although their nickname was New Guard. The Guard cavalry was more varied. The Chasseur Chevelle Light Guard cavalry consisted of 10 squadrons, one of which was made up of Mamelukes. The Mamelukes were later formed up into an entire regiment. The Guard Grenadier Chevelle, either heavy or medium cavalry, I'm not quite sure, consisted of 8 squadrons. In both cases, the velites were not to be used in the field army and probably were used in the role of a depot squadron or to take reinforcements from. The dragoons originally consisted of a single squadron, but this was raised to 4 in 1807 and thus became a full regiment and called the Empress Dragoon Regiment, which is reasonably famous. The Guard Chevalier Léger Polonais, or Light Polish Regiment, consisted of 4 squadrons, but none were armed with a lance in 1805 to 1807. In 1804, Napoleon formalised the corps structure, which was only informally used prior to this. The structure was to serve him well right up until 1815. Each corps consisted of between 1 and 5 infantry divisions, in most cases 2 to 3. There was also a cavalry division, in some rare cases 2 cavalry divisions, and finally a foot artillery and horse artillery regiment, or collection of batteries at least. The heavy guns were normally kept in corps reserve, with the medium guns being allocated to the various divisions as required. The infantry division consisted of 2 brigades and an artillery battalion or battery. When you look at the TIEL of the various battles, there was often a single brigade consisting of only a single light regiment and 1 to 2 other brigades consisting of 2 line infantry regiments each. In battle, each brigade would have a number of squadrons of light cavalry attached, which is not shown here and is generally taken from the cavalry division. The cavalry division consisted of a number of cavalry brigades, each consisting of 2 to 3 cavalry regiments. They were normally light cavalry. Most of these formations were farmed out to the infantry brigades, but some remained independent in order to act as reserve. This independent formation could also contain a horse artillery battery taken from the artillery reserve. Now let's look at actual TIELs. This is the Guard Corps in 1805 with a Guard battalion from Italy included, as well as a few other formations. In this order of battle, the Mamelukes are in regiment size, and a gendarmerie cavalry regiment is added to this. I'm not quite sure if this is formally a part of the Guard, but it seems to always be in the Guard Corps regardless, so maybe I should add it into my earlier slides. In 1806, the Guard Corps had grown significantly. It's probably the Guards which experienced the greatest change between the period of 1805 and 1806. The Dragoon Brigade shown here consisted of dragoon regiments which lacked horses, because thus I assume they were considered elite enough to be resided in the Guard Corps. The cavalry remained at a total of 4 regiments, although now they were organised into brigades. Let's now look at a standard infantry corps. This shows the first corps in 1805. The light infantry was independent and acted as the advanced guard of the corps. Within the infantry divisions, the brigade structure seems to be rather ad hoc. This was to change in 1806, but in most cases the regiments would form pairs, supported by an artillery battery and at least 2 squadrons of light cavalry. The cavalry division consisted of light cavalry. If 6 squadrons were allocated to the infantry, this still left 10 squadrons available for independent action. There was normally horse artillery as well that could have been attached to them, which gave it a fairly powerful reserve force. There was a reasonable amount of variability in terms of the reserve artillery, but the artillery reserve seemed to consist of at least 3 batteries. I'm uncertain what the structure was, but 2 foot batteries of 8 guns and a third battery of 8 guns, possibly horse artillery, seemed reasonable. Let's move forward to 1806. This shows the first corps in 1806, 12 months later. The first corps was a large corps, just to note, consisting of 3 infantry divisions, although each division was slightly smaller than, let's say, the second corps divisions. The first point is the more formal use of brigades, with regiments, in the most part, pairing up within a brigade. The light regiments were in separate brigades, performing light infantry functions. This was to change later in the war, but in 1805 to 1807 the lights were considered as fast infantry and used in that particular role, probably similar to the Grenadiers in the Austrian army. Each division now had an artillery battery permanently attached while in the field. While in 1805 the artillery was generally distributed in this manner anyway, it was not formal and depended on the corps commander. Of course, in peacetime the artillery were in their own specific artillery regiments, so I'm only referring to when the corps was in the field. The artillery was mainly 3-pounders, 4-pounders and 6-pounders, although in some rare cases you will find 12-pounders. During this period there was a pretty wide variety of artillery in the French army. Apart from very rare 12-pounders, the heavier guns, specifically the 12-pounders, normally resided at the corps level, as did for some reason the horse artillery, which normally consisted of rather light guns, such as 3-pounders in this case. You will notice how non-standard the batteries were. The cavalry now consisted of only a single brigade with 3 regiments rather than 2 brigades, 2 regiments each. This did vary, but on the whole this was where the light cavalry were positioned initially, with at least 6 squadrons allocated to the 3 infantry divisions, as mentioned earlier. I'm not quite sure why the brigade structure was broken up like this. I expect because if you allocate 6 squadrons off to the infantry, there was not enough independent cavalry to warrant the use of 2 brigade level headquarters. Anyway, that's my guess. Now let's move to the cavalry corps. This shows the cavalry corps in 1805. The 1st Division breakdown of the cavalry corps is not shown here, but was similar to the 2nd Division. The corps contained all the medium and heavy cavalry, in this case 2 cuirassiers and 2 dragoon divisions, with 1 light brigade supporting it. The cuirassier division consisted of 2 brigades of 2 regiments each, in this case only 3 squadrons per regiment. I'm assuming the 4th squadron was left behind as a depot formation. You can see the average size of each squadron was about 120 men. The horse artillery was also attached to this division, as it was to the 1st Division. The dragoon division consisted of 2 to 3 dragoon brigades, each of which had 2 regiments. No horse artillery was provided as support in this case, although the corps contained batteries which could have been allocated if required. Finally, the corps had a single brigade of light cavalry, as well as corps-level artillery. I assume there was about 6 horse artillery batteries in the artillery reserve, based on the numbers that you see here. This shows the cavalry corps in 1806. The basic structure remains the same, although it was much larger in 1806. The only significant change was the light cavalry brigade was expanded to a full light cavalry division. For those not interested in actual figure gaming, then the video from this point on uses the data so far collected in creating army lists, so those folks may wish to exit now. For those interested in figure gaming, then this section from this point on attempts to convert the TIELs into a force mix for a set of figure gaming rules. Converting all this data into an army list is not a simple matter, and this depends on the scale of rules you are using. For example, at 50 men per figure, you could field a force of 10,000 men. This represents 50 to 60 elements, each of which consists of 4 infantry or 2 cavalry, with the bulk being infantry. The problem is the corps ranged in size from between 15,000 to 30,000, so you could only field part of a corps, perhaps 2 infantry divisions and a cavalry brigade. This means we get a total of 68 elements, a large force mix, but manageable for a game. However, there is no medium or heavy cavalry, nor are there any guards or heavy artillery. There are only 12 elements of cavalry in total. This is an accurate force mix, but one which most players would not be particularly happy to field because all their nice guards and heavy cavalry and medium cavalry would not be used. Let's drill down and see what it looks like in terms of figures. This shows a typical division using WRG scales of 50 to 1 for infantry, 40 to 1 for cavalry, and 2 to 1 for artillery. It's accurate, but as you can see here, the overwhelming amount of figures is infantry. If we change the figure scale to, let's say, 100 men per figure, we can start to field an entire corps, but we still lack supporting heavy or medium cavalry as well as guards. To simulate Austerlitz, you would probably need a scale of 1 in 700, or each infantry element represents 2,800 men, or almost a brigade. But the scale of 1 in 100 seems to be a good building block to use if you want to create an army list that is applicable to a wide range of different rules. This shows a typical corps using a scale of 100 to 1 for infantry, 80 to 1 for cavalry, and 8 to 1 for artillery. It's the first corps in 1806. It totals 44 elements and would be a viable force mix for a game. It also begins to give you a more interesting element mix with more cavalry and a variety of artillery. This shows the first and second corps in 1806 using a scale of 201 for infantry, 160 to 1 for cavalry, and 16 to 1 for artillery. Each block of elements represents a division or a brigade for the cavalry. A player could choose a cavalry corps or guard corps for the second corps. As the scale goes up, the variety and choices of each player increases. Based on this, a player would need to go to a scale of 1 in 600 to reproduce, let's say, Austerlitz or Jena. This reduces the size of the infantry division to about 2 to 3 elements each. The ground scale in this case would be 1 in 10,000 and the playing area 3 by 4 feet in order to reduce the manoeuvring which went on before the battle. Of course, if a player possessed a larger playing area and was prepared to game over several days, then a playing area of 6 by 4 foot, ground scale of 1 in 5,000, and an element mix of 100 per side allows you to drop the scale to, let's say, 1 in 300 for infantry. This is also a viable game, but would probably take 2 days to play, or one incredibly intensive day of gaming by 2 very experienced players. So now in summary, I think the optimal method of creating army lists is either using the formal TOE of a battle, fair enough, or alternatively, grab a period and focusing on a standard corps size formation in that period as the basic unit. If you're going with the latter, to get the element count down to a practical level, you need to start with a scale of 1 in 100 for infantry, allowing you to build up your core army size list. Players would scale this up as required to allow them to fight the battle they wish to fight. Marengo, for example, which is a small battle, would require you to scale to, let's say, 1 in 200. Thus, the army list that is presented would represent 2 corps size formations, and that player would simply divide it in half. Now, I know Marengo used divisional size corps, but I'm hoping you get the point. Players who wish to use rules which use a scale of 1 in 50 or 1 in 60 would pick the corps and then just select the units from the corps they wish to fight with and play away. In summary, I'm pretty certain it is not possible to create a useful army list for a set of rules which uses a scale of, let's say, 1 to 50 and multiply this up accordingly. I think this can only occur if you start with a scale of 1 in 100 men per figure and attempt to model a full corps in your army list and scale that up and down as required. Each nationality may require more than one corps size formation type, so most armies use an advanced guard corps and a cavalry corps or equivalents. Thus, a player could basically look at their standard corps and let's say divide it in half for a single corps if you're going to a scale of 1 in 200, and then go to your cavalry corps and do the same. And that way they get a nice mix. I mean, it's cavalry heavy, but at least they have the option of basically fielding all those nice figures that they've painted up. And so we come to a close of part 5 of my organisation series, in this case covering the French army between the years of 1804 and 1807. Denken Sie daran, immer für Hill, Hamilton zu kämpfen.